I'm very happy to welcome you here tonight. This is our annual Niarchos lecture, which is our biggest event of the year. And I'm very pleased to welcome and introduce here Professor Peter Frankopan from the University of Oxford, who is a noted historian of Byzantium, and not just that. And I think that's the interesting part. Reading his CV actually made me recall a lecture we had 2 years ago by Artemis Cooper, who spoke about Patrick Leigh Fermor. And the reason why I make this comparison is that if you look at his varied interests, at Peter's various interests, that range from history to contemporary affairs to running hotels in the Mediterranean, to sports of all kinds, to music of a very sophisticated nature, you realize that he's a man of many talents in many dimensions, very much like a lot of the young Oxford graduates that the Special Operations Executive used during the Second World War to create sabotage actions against the Germans. Patrick Leigh Fermor famously kidnapped a German general in Crete. No such thing in your CV yet,
so far.
Peter.
Yeah.
So Peter got his BA at Cambridge and his PhD at Oxford, and he's been teaching at Oxford since then. He has written very extensively, both highly specialized, scholarly articles and books about Byzantium. I will single out his translation, for example, of the Alexiad, which is one of the most interesting contemporary historical accounts of a very key period of the Byzantine Empire. But he's also written about the First Crusade, and most recently he's written this very interesting, very thick, and very broadly encompassing book called the Silk Roads, A New History of the World, which is going to inform his talk today, which in a sense connects the study of Byzantium with the challenges of the contemporary world, most notably with an area of the world which is not very well studied and even less understood, especially in the United States. Just to give you a sense of the broad range of his scholarship and how that informs both his research and his perspective, I'll just mention that this book draws on sources in Greek, Latin, French, Italian, German, Dutch, Spanish, Portuguese, Swedish, Russian, Arabic, Turkish, Persian, Hebrew, Syriac, and Chinese. Have I missed something?
I think there must be something missing. Yeah.
So it's a great pleasure to welcome you here. Thank you very much for honoring us with your presence, and we very much look forward to your presentation tonight.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. It's a real pleasure to be here and a real honour to follow in the footsteps of so many very distinguished scholars who've come to speak at Yale for this annual Stavros Niarchos Foundation lecture. I'm very humbled to be here, and thank you for giving up an evening in the sunshine when you could be out with a glass of white wine, a cold beer, for choosing to come here instead. So I will try to make the evening as lively as possible. I think we're happy to have questions afterwards. I think if that's part of the drill. But thank you very much for inviting me, Professor Kalivas, also to John and to George for arranging my visit. Like I said, it's a pleasure to be here. I first came to New Haven about in the middle of the 90s, nearly 25 years ago, and that made me reflect on how the world has changed since then. I'm a child of the Cold War. I left school in 1989, and I travelled to the United States. We have a year off, or we used to have years off, to try and make us into men. So we'd arrive at university ready to go, and I visited in 1991, 25 years ago exactly. And I think it's worth reflecting on how the world looked at that time, because since 1991, the world has been on the move, but I came here first at a time of great hope in the world. The Berlin Wall had just come down. There'd been broadly a revolution in Russia, or attempted revolution, which led very quickly after the shelling of the White House in Moscow to the peaceful breakup of the Soviet Union into 15 constituent republics, a transition that very few people had expected. My first love was really with Russian as a teenage boy, and the disintegration of Russia happening without any major violence. This was a time when boundaries were coming down across the world, where Mandela walked free and South Africa transitioned again through democratic means into a state which has its challenges still today. But again, as a child growing up, one never thought that transition would happen that way. In 1989, the date of the Tiananmen Square protests, despite this very haunting and very famous image, China then set itself on a path towards opening up and towards reform, a process that is not yet complete, but China has, I think, fair to say, embraced many facets of taking part within the family of nations that it hadn't done up until that point. February 1991 was a point where the First Gulf War came to an end, where George H.W. Bush this time said very clearly, this is not a time for euphoria or a time to gloat. This is a time to focus on looking beyond victory and war towards peace in the Middle East. And it seemed that the alignment of the stars would make that happen, with agreements between Arafat and Rabin in the early 90s as well, and an understanding at that time in the United States government that regime change in Iraq would be expensive. As Dick Cheney said when asked about it in the early 90s, was it worthwhile removing Saddam Hussein? He said, I've asked myself many times how many US casualties that'd be worth, and the answer is not very damn many. That's a quote. That optimism in the early 90s gave way to an idea that we'd reached something which was called, memorably, the end of history, a time when the world had realised that, and political systems had realised that liberal democracy would triumph. We'd learnt in the 20th century at enormous cost what persecution of minorities or even majorities because of their ethnicity, their religion, their skin colour, their sexuality or their gender led to. We learnt emphatically that human beings are capable of inflicting profound suffering on each other, and that the virtues of those lessons, painfully learnt, was that transition to liberal democracy would allow everybody to live in peace and happiness in the future. Today, 25 years later, the world looks very different. We, I think, live at a time of recognition of the fragilities and the challenges facing us, whether it's about growing populations, whether it's about the competition for resources, climate change, new pathogens, the Zika virus, or the rise of new ideologies. The world today in 2016 feels a very long way removed from how it did at that point of the death of history, the end of history. And these themes have been picked up, of course, at government level. So the United States Defense Department review in 2012 talks very explicitly, with an introduction by President Obama, of a transition of the United States away finally from Europe towards Asia, a world being on the move, echoed in a British Defense Department review that looks forward till 2040. This is a time of great fragilities that we all recognise and understand. And these challenges in front of us, I think it's striking to me, all are in the same parts of the world, more or less here. And I think mapping individual crises on their own sometimes means that we don't see the big picture. Here, if I have my pointer, I did have my pointer, I maybe turned my pointer away. These are the current challenges in the world, which may escalate far beyond where we currently see them. I don't need to talk to each of them. Clearly, problems in the Middle East, in northern Iraq and in Syria, but also in Yemen, in Libya, the failure of the Arab Spring, the Horn of Africa, Kashmir, which I'm sure all of you follow closely, where there's been an escalation in the last few months, the rise of the Taliban, not just in Afghanistan, but putting pressure into Tajikistan and neighbouring countries, and Turkmenistan, likewise, pressure and conquest of the annexation of the Crimea and of eastern Ukraine, potential flashpoints in the South China Sea, and missile attempts, nuclear explosions, I beg your pardon, in North Korea just in the last week. These stars that I put on the map together all have individually the potential to impact our daily life in a very profound way. And each one of those potentially is at a point where things can only get worse rather than better. I talked to a friend of mine this morning and asked who would be the Franz Ferdinand. What is the moment that changes the world today to make these fragile flashpoints, to make them even worse? That's something which we can have a game looking at afterwards. But the impact of this world in front of us on our daily lives is profound. It affects the price of the gas we put in our car. It affects the price of the bread that we buy in the shops. When there was a ban put on by President Putin about 5 years ago on Russian wheat exports, global wheat prices went up by 15% in 48 hours. And that may not be instantly noticeable here in New Haven, certainly not noticeable back home in Oxford, but it is noticeable if you live below the poverty line in these parts of the world. That interconnectedness and those complex fragilities require, I think, a way in which it might be worth looking at the world in the present day in a more joined up way than the specialisms of looking at individual regions. I think one thing is clear, though, that we are a long way from facing the end of history, because as far as the triumph of liberal democracy goes, the world looks very different to me. These countries, all along the Silk Roads, by the way, which is the hint of what I'm going to be talking about. These countries from the Eastern Mediterranean, from Turkey through to China, all have several common denominators. They have a ruler at the top who presides over what a historian would call a royal court, even if we're not talking about royalty in its formal meaning. But presidential authority, they have low human rights rankings, there's very limited press freedom, restrictions on freedom of worship, or downright prohibition, low tolerance of minorities, zero tolerance in many places on sexualities, and opaque legal systems. In other words, the antithesis of that triumph of liberal democracy. And I'm not going to talk today about the pressure on the concept of liberal democracy in the Western world, but there are themes, I think, that are tearing both the West as well as these Silk Road countries in the same direction. Of course, the problem is we as historians tend to focus very narrowly on Europe and the developed world, to the point that I saw a statistic last month that says that in the UK, 93% of history faculty specialise in Western European history, or the history of the West, including the United States. So when 7% of the faculty are focused on the world, which includes Latin America, of course, includes Africa, includes all of Asia, then it means that the students, those who are going to run businesses, going to be involved in the charitable sector, going to be involved in the political decision-making, have a concept of the past that will be far removed, perhaps, from the reality. And when I was a boy, as I said, I was a child of the Cold War, it was striking to me that the only history I learnt about at school was that of Europe. And in fact, it wasn't even the history of Europe that I learnt about. I learnt about the history of this part of Europe. You're very fortunate here to have a program in Hellenic Studies, but broadly speaking, all of you here, I'm not going to do a quiz, but we can all name a German philosopher, or a Spanish artist, or a French novelist, or an Italian composer. But when we start to think about the contributions of the Hungarians to European culture, of Poland, of Croatia, Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, Greece, Ukraine, very few of us are engaged with the present or with the past. And that expands into other parts of the world too. How many people can name a current Arab pop singer, or a great Indian film star, or the best Russian contemporary novelist, or a Chinese artist, composer, philosopher, cultural figure from the 20th century? That disengagement from the past, I think, is a real problem, particularly at this moment of transition. And, sorry, I'll come back to that in a second. In my own university, Oxford, which is a very famous and distinguished institution, just as a simple sign of how disconnected we are from the reality of the past, there is, in the Museum of Natural History, there are 27 busts of the world's greatest scientists. And all of them are people you will have heard of and expect to be there. Charles Darwin, Galileo, Ptolemy, Euclid, Pythagoras. But there's not a single figure recognised amongst those 27 from the Arabic world. Not one from India, not one from China, let alone from the continent of Africa or the Americas. And that distortion of how we even understand common concepts like the history of science and the validity of scholarship is something that I think needs to be addressed in the modern world. Some people call it Eurocentrism, and in many universities, the encouragement is for students to use history like a buffet and to go and learn to take a course on Southeast Asian history or to learn something about Mesoamerican culture and society without ever trying to see those connections and those big joined up dots. The world that I look at, and I've written about in my new book, along the Silk Roads, which is a sort of catch-all. There is no Silk Road, there are no Silk Roads. It's a convenient catch-all to explain the intensive connections that have meshed Asia together. Here I show you some of the images from Samarkand here. This beautiful, stunning locations here, Herat in western Afghanistan, that were once central to global and intellectual life and to global culture and politics. And when we think of the Silk Roads, we tend to think here in Isfahan, inside the Shah Mosque. We tend to think of camels, long-distance trade, and of course the trade in silks. And the geography of the Silk Roads, forbidding, difficult, and treacherous. But this world was irrelevant. I was never taught anything about it. And what I did know and what I learned about as I got older, I would have the name Genghis Khan and Timur thrown at me. And those images that I showed you evoke an exoticism. They evoke a time when, for some reason, there was a flourishing across the heart of Asia and a sense that there was once a disequilibrium to that past that I knew something about from school. But fortunately, my eyes were opened by the discovery of the Byzantine world when I was an undergraduate at Cambridge. It had never crossed my mind that the history of half of our continent in Europe had been written out of the story and how that had happened. And why was it that parts of the world that had once been showered in rays of golden brilliance had both been forgotten, and how had they been supplanted? And as I grew up looking around the buildings that I found most beautiful, I've been culturally tuned to admire Chatsworth on the top left, here images from the United States, from your own city in New Haven, the courthouse. This expropriation of the classical world, of the architecture of ancient Greece, translated and transplanted all over the world because we have rewritten history to become heirs to the democracy of Athens. We've become heirs of the culture of Homer and of Virgil and the classical world, while ignoring the culture of other related areas to the east, because it suited us to have that conception of the past. And of course, to the Greeks, that would come as a surprise, because the Hellenic world, again, I talked about this earlier today with George, the Hellenic world was focused entirely in its gaze to the east. It never crossed the mind of Alexander the Great to conquer Europe when he wanted to take over the world. There was nothing of any value or of interest there. The Greek contribution to the Mediterranean beyond the Peloponnese and beyond the Aegean Sea were settler colonies in Sicily and in the Adriatic. But Greeks knew that threat, prestige, danger, opportunity lay in Asia. Hence the obsession with the Persians, hence the great rivalry with the Persians. Hence, when Alexander wanted to conquer the world, he headed east. This is what mattered in the classical world. These connections that spread statues, that brought ideas about culture, about art in both directions. And when one starts to read the Ramayana and sees echoes from the Iliad, when one starts to see borrowings from that Virgil and Greek and Roman texts have from the Mahabharata and the great Sanskrit works, one starts to look at a world that is intimately interconnected. We live today convinced that globalization is new. But this world, 2,500 years ago, was one where ideas, where cultural forms, where political systems and fashion spread, to the point that those images today we see of the Buddha that we're all familiar with, a well-fed figure who enjoys life, were brought and influenced by statues of the Greek god Apollo, brought by Alexander and his men into Central Asia, where the inroads of Greek theology started to provoke reactions with Buddhism and what Buddhism should mean, and led to a reinvigoration, a re-understanding of what Buddhist ritual should look like, what Buddhist prayer should sound like, how it should entertain, and those statues of Apollo, replacing very, very rare statues that predate the 4th century BC, those very few that we have of the Buddha are emaciated figures, because of course, as all of you will be familiar, Buddhism is about control, it's about self-denial, it's about not overindulging, and the sudden influence of the need to show and to link prosperity with being well-fed shaped Gandharan art that then went on to shape even Buddhist images that we see today. And that process works in both ways, so that the halo, the classic symbol in Christian art, is brought from Asia, where Zoroastrianism and Buddhism, the sanctity of an individual, immediately recognized by the ring around the head. And this world was not just important to the ancient Greeks who looked east. Rome looked east. Rome was anchored in the east. Because of the European Union, because of the way we try to configure the past, because of the way we design our buildings, because of the way we describe our aristocrats who in the 19th and 18th century would be portrayed in Britain wearing togas to look like Roman senators. But Rome's centre of gravity lay in the Nile in the first instance. Rome went from being a town on the shin of Italy into being an empire with the conquest of Egypt and the Nile and the granaries. But Rome's focus, again, as had been the case with ancient Athens and with Alexander, was on the east, to the point that the rivalry in the Parthian Empire drove conquest, drove trade, drove ideas, to the point that by the 4th century, Constantine, the Emperor Constantine, decided to build a new Rome closer to the action. It was called New Rome, and in fact, very soon was being nicknamed the city of Constantine, Constantinople, which looked and was designed to look like Rome itself. And when the Western Roman half of the empire fell, it fell because it was essentially expendable. The heart kept on beating in Constantinople for another 1,000 years, rebranded by later historians to be called the Byzantine Emperor and the Byzantine Empire. But this was a world that was entirely Roman in fashion, and in fact Roman in language, until a transition towards using Greek in the 6th and 7th centuries. That city of Constantinople was the one which lit me up, I think, and why I'm an academic today, because I discovered a world that was unexploited, unexplored, forgotten, and yet the central point of contact between these great continents. I don't have my pointer. What I was most excited about was seeing how the Byzantine world connected with the rest of these 3 great continents, which were separate from the Americas until the voyages of Columbus. And the world that I worked on for my doctoral studies was one that was multilateral, multi-connected, that joined culture from Scandinavia and from Iceland, and visitors from Iceland, with one of my favourite, Bolli Bollason, who came to serve in Constantinople in the 10th century in the Imperial Guard, and then came home after 15 years or so away to be met by a crowd who fawned over his luxurious clothes that he was wearing, these new fashions that he brought back with him from Constantinople, and then until he realised there was one person not waiting for him on the quay, his wife, who was standing waiting to give him a talking to. The world where artisans from Constantinople were sent to build the Grand Mosque in Cordoba. A world where connections between Constantinople created the states that became Russia and the Ukraine through trading nations and trading systems linking the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea with Scandinavia, where the interventions and cooperation and rivalry with the Arabic or the Islamic Caliphate in the 7th century onwards provide valves for communication across the Caucasus, right the way across Asia. One of the most exciting things that's happening today is the sheer number of Byzantine coins being discovered in graves in not just Western China, but in Pacific China too. This interconnected world where those boundaries, those intellectual boundaries that we put up that configure Europe to exist on its own, isolated from the rest of the world, is what I'm so excited about looking at. And I think it's time in this changing world to look at these transitions. Here's a map to show trading routes 2,000 years ago. It's a little bit simplistic, but reports from southern India, the excitement of Indian traders seeing the annual arrival of Roman ships and Greek ships spraying foam over the prows as they sailed to come and buy pepper, to come and buy ceramics, to come and buy textiles, because Europe didn't have anything of any value. And actually, probably the truth is it never has anything of any value. Europe's great systematized competitive advantage was the preponderance towards violence. Europe is a culture which has produced castle building and castle building techniques, has produced all of the major technological advances in weapons development, to the point that at the end of the Second World War we developed weapons in the West that were capable of killing the entire world population. The process of how families could generate and build up assets and protect them for centuries was something that has a very different profile across Asia, where the constant recycling of assets looks very different. And some of these big questions are ones that I think more historians could be looking at. I saw an interview with the late, great David Bowie. He doesn't get cited by too many of my colleagues. Earlier this week, saying that good work is produced when you walk out into the sea just to the point where your feet can't touch the bottom. And those of us who are historians know exactly how and when we are comfortable and when we're taking some chances to go and work on new, different and more complicated topics. But it seemed to me self-evident that this world that I look at is the one that all history and all historians should start from. Because this heart of the world, these connectors, the web that links Asia with one end of Asia across the other and to the Mediterranean, is where everything happened. This is where our ancestors first learnt to cultivate wheat. This is where our ancestors first learnt how to build cities. Civilization began in Mesopotamia, right here in the middle of the map. These melting point are where all of the world's major language groups collide. The Semitic languages, the Indo-European, the Altaic languages of the steppes, the Sino-Tibetan languages, must be another one, something of the Caucasian, very complicated languages, to the point that when I come here to the United States, I'm not planning on being arrested this evening, but if I do get caught and busted, I will be defined as a Caucasian male. There is some connection we have still with this part of the world. But this is where all of our major global religions have either sprung from or competed with each other. This is where this cauldron, this heart of the world, is where things happen. And this is the place I think one can stand to look at and ask questions about the past in antiquity, the Middle Ages, as we call them, the early modern, the modern world, and in fact the world of tomorrow. Because those clusters of stars, of challenges, and the opportunities that also lie in this region requires us to spend some time studying those countries, peoples, languages, and so on. And it's not just trade that flows through these systems, it's not just ideas, so too do pathogens. So I map here on this map, in the thick black line, the spread of the Black Death, which rises from Central Asian plague foci, probably triggered by a climate event that leads to a sudden rise in global temperatures by probably 1 to 1.5 degrees centigrade, that changes the enzootic cycle of the parasite that spreads through fleas particularly, and kills eventually 25% or so of the population of Europe and the Middle East. These connections that we have between us are across Asia are the ones that matter, and many of them are very localized. It's wrong to think of the Silk Roads running and linking China with the West. Most of the traffic, most of the trade along these connectors are localized, and we know that because how we engage with our neighbors. We see our neighbors more often than anyone else, and we get annoyed with our neighbors more often than anyone else, and exotic visitors from Oxford normally can arrive and leave without provoking confrontation and so on, because the exoticism of a new arrival is particularly interesting, but actually the day-to-day is important. And that low hum of constant borrowing along the spine of Asia means that the rhythms of cooperation, the rhythms of violence, look very different, because until about 1600 or so, prosperity and tolerance were to be found in the East. These are all linked. It's no surprise, I think, today, when we see the rise of the far right in Europe, the disappointment with political elites through Brexit, perhaps through the current election that you're going to have in November here, when the economics start to stagnate, people start to ask different questions. When inequality starts to rise, people start to look for different answers. And the rhythm, unlike Europe, where there's not a decade between 1350 and the end of the Second World War, where there's not some European violence, where there's not a war involving European powers, should I say, the profile of exchange in Asia looks different because this was the richest part of the world. Trade is a very positive thing to make exchange and to allow people to give each other the ability to express themselves, because when you're self-confident, you are able to show the best parts of our characters as human beings: compassion, kindness, creativity, sponsorship of scholars. 500 years ago, if I'd been, my equivalent wouldn't have been anywhere near New England. I'd have been in Bukhara or in Isfahan or maybe Mosul or Samarkand, and you would have been too. Scholarship translated and moved towards Europe as a result of the fact that Europe took control of these trading mechanisms, first through the discovery of the Americas. I've got a picture of Columbus, but also through the discovery of a route around southern Africa to India. And that European technological, those advances, that pressure to innovate, which has lots of different explanations for it, allowing bigger ships to be able to transport more over longer distances quicker, enabled Europe to connect into these global trading mechanisms. And the winner in that process was Western Europe, and the loser was Eastern Europe. And eventually the loser became Asia itself, as trading partnerships soon became empires. But what happened through the process of this sudden integration of all the world's continents into global trading systems was that bullion flowed from the Americas, particularly from Central and Southern America in the first instance, into Spain and into eventually the Dutch Republic and into Britain. And that flow of cash didn't just enrich those local populations at the expense, of course, of the Native American populations, but they were used to suddenly invigorate those who were selling in the East, in India and in China particularly, to the point that leaders in India were suddenly able to afford to commemorate their dead spouses in this kind of fashion. And Columbus, who had been trying to not find out if the world was round or to see if there was anything there, Columbus was trying to find trade routes through to India and to China, and was convinced, as many were, that he'd found some part of India unexplored. But there's some irony, I think, that the wealth of the Indians, as they were called, funded the jewels of the real Indians here on this part of the world. These interconnections are very important and very revealing. That process of building empire meant that the pressure to find new ways to secure those assets became increasingly intensive. Here, in the start of the 20th century, the transition was no longer towards silks, ceramics, textiles, spices that characterized trade in the early modern world, but to new black gold, oil. And that process of retaining control over oil wells has shaped the world that we see today. Of course, here with the Sykes-Picot map on the top right, after the discovery of oil in vast quantities in Persia and in Mesopotamia. And it's not just the Sykes-Picot, the Treaty of Sèvres that follows, but that competition, which even in the First World War was being described by the British Cabinet Office as a major priority of British war aims, by the Second World War, the United States was calling it, the United States diplomat was calling the oil of the Middle East the greatest single prize in human history. And the attempts of the West to try to keep hold of access to that oil has, of course, had the obvious long-term implications. It's had the implication eventually of regime overthrow by Ayatollah Khomeini in 1979. I'm not even going to talk about the Iraq War or bin Laden, but the attempts of the West to try to intervene for good and for bad in these parts of the world to keep control of those trade networks and to retain political and economic influence driven by the pressure of oil. the world looks very different at the moment from China's point of view, because although we are obsessed about the fragilities of the world, of political systems and the quality of life, China, even in the state of its new normal, is taking a slightly more optimistic and more pragmatic view to how to see the world. Here's Xi Jinping in Astana in Kazakhstan 3 years ago, talking about his new signature economic and foreign policy called the One Belt, One Road Initiative, that essentially is a series of massive infrastructure investment into pipelines, into high-speed rail links, into energy development, into local poverty alleviations and towards energy projects, for example, in Pakistan, that is as much about securing China's own long-term economic needs as it sees them, but also to understanding that that world of Asia is going to solve its own problems, and that the West's chances of trying to do so have run their natural course. And this new One Road, One Belt initiative, I think, is about a new world that's forming in front of our eyes. To me, as a historian, I have no ability to look forward into the future, but I am able to see that that pivot that Obama talked of, that rise of something in the East, in Asia, is something that is taking shape in front of our eyes. At one extreme, towards religious fundamentalism of ISIS, but at other extremes, attempts of states to try to find solutions for themselves, trying to find new ways of cooperating through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, through currency swaps, through oil swaps, to trying to manage relationships which the West are conspicuous by their absence. And these new connectors, I think, are profoundly important and will have a significant impact on the world in front of us. Last month, China announced that it was going to quintuple gas imports. China's energy needs are expected to treble in the next 13 or 14 years. And access to raw materials, even at a time of economic stagnation, is important to plan for the future. The short-termism of our democratic system turns out to be our Achilles heel. Politicians who need to be elected every 4 years, a presidential campaign that runs through in 2-year cycles before new candidates get chosen, don't allow for long-term planning. It's a reaction to events. That's how we've learnt the frailties of democracy. But this world presents opportunities, and to that extent, it's the perfect invitation to be here today in Yale at the Stavros Niarchos Foundation, because this is train lines shown on too, because Stavros Niarchos and the foundation that he endowed were built at exactly this time of transition. The shipping fleet that grew in the 1950s and 1960s understood that there was the need for technological change. The Niarchos fleet was famous for innovating and creating bigger tankers, bigger ships, and trying to understand that the world's needs of matching buyer and seller would be closer together, and that those who could exploit and understand those rhythms of who needed what and where, that would be where fortunes could be made, and that's where the smart money should be looking. And Niarchos, to that extent, was very similar to other oils in the engine, like the Sogdians, who produced the culture here on the walls in Panjikent in Central Asia. And there is some, I think, rather charming analogy in that you can compare the Sogdian camels that transported goods from one side of the world to the other with the Niarchos shipping fleet that did exactly the same thing. Those who are able to understand the world are able to engage from it and also to profit from it, and those who profit from it, I think, have an obligation to give back. And that's why it's such an honor to be here with the patronage of the Stavros Niarchos Foundation, very fitting. But it's particularly fitting to be here in Yale, because those students of you here who will know everything about Elihu Yale will know that Yale also was a man whose fortune was made at a time of transition, who understood the world around him. This is written on his tombstone in Wales, slightly unpromisingly in southern Wales. Born an American, in Europe bred, in Africa travelled, and in Asia wed. Where long he lived and thrived, in London dead, much good some ill he did. So hope all's even, and that his soul through mercy's gone to, well, heaven. And Yale, like Stavros Niarchos, endowed what was then called the Collegiate School of Connecticut that were so excited by this endowment and were so pleased that there might be more to come that they renamed the university Yale in his honour. And Niarchos and Yale and the Sogdians and the Armenians, other communities that have understood that the world is changing and have reacted to it, have learned that they can do well from it. One of my favourite quotes, and I start my book with a quote near the start of my book by a king of Zhao in China in 307 BC, who says that to understand the past and the present, it's not sufficient to follow the ways of yesterday. If you want to understand how today is going to look, you need to adapt. And that adaptation starts with education, and it starts with history, where we learn what's important, where we have curricula that teach the next generation about regions, peoples, themes, topics that are important. So I hope you have a chance to read my book, but it's a pleasure to come here and talk to you about parts of the world which, as Professor Kaliva said, don't often get airtime, but if you ask me, is where we should start looking at history rather than end it. Thank you very much. If they're gentle, I can handle questions. Yes?
Fantastic. Out of all the wonderful research that you did, what was there that really surprised you that you came across you did not expect it, but was very important, a big aha moment that really helped you?
That's a little bit like asking who shot JR. I don't want to reveal too many of the surprises and jewels. Well, I tell you, so one of the things that I've worked on for a while is the rise of Europe from what used to be called the Dark Ages. So when I was at school, most people's concept of history, we learned about the Romans, and then the next thing I was taught about was the Battle of Hastings. That's what my children are learning too, by the way. They're learning a history syllabus that would have worked 100 years ago. That 1,000 years is just passed by as being irrelevant. And what I wanted to understand was how was it that Western Europe starts to rise again? That period from 1,000 to 0 to 1,000 is spectacularly interesting and exciting if you look at Constantinople, the Eastern Mediterranean, the Byzantine Empire, and you see a world reacting, glorious, glowing. I don't have any slides here of the churches that I could show you, but in the West, people stop building in stone. We can look at, this is a fantastic time to be a historian because the resources we can use include looking at ice cores from Greenland, where we can see what kind of levels of pollution there were. And after the fall of Rome, copper production in Europe essentially goes back to prehistoric, well, it doesn't essentially, it goes back to prehistoric levels. People stop being able to read. Charlemagne very famously, well, if you're a medieval historian, Charlemagne used to sleep with a writing board under his pillow so he could practice writing letters, spelling his name. And his biographer Einhard says the problem is he left it a little bit too late in life, so never mastered the art of writing. European leaders couldn't read, couldn't write. They built castles. And that, I wanted to understand about that Dark Ages. What is it that galvanizes Europe towards the more familiar picture of castle building, the Crusades, the knight in shining armour, the papacy and so on. And as a sort of closet economic historian, I don't always trust narrative sources, but what we've got lots of in early medieval Europe is data from coins. And I was amazed that when we start to see the levels of coin finds linking Europe with the Middle East particularly, you start to build up a profile of a scale of human trafficking that is probably greater than transatlantic human traffic slave trades, where the amount of coins likely to be found across the Russian river systems, the Vikings were the great exponents of the slave trade. We think of the Vikings as chaotic, disorganized, raping, pillaging, and don't understand that the smart Vikings went east. The traffic they did of human beings is to be measured in silver coins, probably sampled into tens, if not hundreds of millions of silver pieces. And that bullion that starts to light up Scandinavia is the driver that starts to provide an economic boost to Europe. And when you start to read Turkic slave buying guides and Arabic slave buying guides that tell you about how to buy a good slave in Baghdad or in Samarkand in the 800s, 900s, And so don't ever pick a nice-looking guy with floppy hair because he'll be trouble. Make sure you always lie slaves down and press them in the kidneys to make sure that they don't have any diseases wrong with them. You start to see that we have written that story of Europe differently. We don't talk about slave trade in Europe. We don't think when we walk into a bar in Rome or Venice to order a cocktail, when you say ciao, you're saying schiavo, I'm your slave, as a joke. Because Venice was a huge trade slaving centre, to the point that the Pope even had to tell off Venice repeatedly to stop selling slaves. And eventually the Venetians said, okay, but we are allowed to sell people who are not Christian, right? And the Pope says yes. And that name today we don't ever think of the Slavs gives us the word slave. Such is the imprint of the impact of human trafficking in the early Middle Ages. So it galvanizes European economy, it starts to produce the wealth, allows courtly culture to be built up, it allows connections with the East that by the time of the Crusades mean that these guys are not going into the abyss in guesswork of what's happening in Jerusalem. There's quite good understanding and knowledge of what Byzantium and what the Arabic-speaking world looks like. And I think that those kinds of things, of which there are many different examples, reinforces the point that we've always been connected to each other. The only thing that's interesting about the world today is the speed at which we do things. And that has its own challenges, questions, problems, and so on. But that desire to travel, that need for power, that need for status, that willingness to subjugate our fellow human beings, I think is something that, in some ways, funnily enough, a couple of people have said that they find it quite reassuring to know that the world has always been in transition and that these changes of rhythm are nothing to be worried about. You can't manage them. But I think the slave trade, for example, in the 9th and 10th centuries, the scale of it shown by data is astonishing. Yes?
So could you talk more about what you said earlier, how the shifting trade dynamics of Europe and Asia led to the shift of scholarship work from the Middle East to Western Europe?
Well, I've sort of hinted at that, I think, with the Stavros Niarchos Foundation and Yale. To have scholars, you need patronage. You need to have people who are rich enough to endow chairs, to endow scholars, to build auditoria. And the more people who are able to give, the better the quality of the research, the better quality of the teaching, the better everything. That's how that rhythm works. And in Asia, because the Europeans move from being trading partners to imperialists, particularly in the case of the British in India, for example, then those assets start to shift and you kill scholarship locally because the money disappears. So we have a long tradition here of the last 400 years, but I think it's no coincidence there was no major seat of learning in Europe beyond Paris and Bologna, which in the grand scheme of things are modern compared to seats of learning in China, Asia, Constantinople, and so on. But money and education, tolerance, prosperity, all lock in closely together. The last 200 years, I suppose one could make the case that communism in the first instance, nationalisms locally, the attempts in the first instance to prioritize disengagement from empire in India, in the Middle East, in Iran, and so on, have coloured and kneecapped scholarship. But my assumption would be, as these parts of the world start to rise again, that the new campuses and the new scholars will start to congregate in these parts of the world. I think there is already a Yale campus, isn't there, in the Gulf. Haileybury, a secondary school from the United Kingdom, has 2 campuses in Kazakhstan. The ambition of a lot of these states which have resources is to try and attract the best of the best. And in that sense, it's not just scholarship they patronise. They've also bought the best soccer teams. So Paris Saint-Germain, AC Milan, Inter Milan, Chelsea, they're all owned by Russians, Chinese, Persian Gulf. There's an Iranian now who owns Everton in the Champions League, in the Premier League in the UK too. That process of using your resources is an important part, I think, of understanding the rhythms of history. We're at a particular bite point right now because of global commodity prices. I'm not a speculator. I've got no way to prove what's going to happen next. I think right now this is not a great time for many of these oil-producing countries because of new technologies, because of assumptions about where proven resources might be. But as a historian, I can tell you there's fragilities between Saudi and Yemen, Saudi and Iran, any lack of resolution of Syria and Iraq, increased problems in Ukraine. These fragilities are liable to produce spikes that will then start to change the attitude. So it's at the moment, most of these countries are hitting super fragile status. So Russia has got its lowest reserves since independence, and is likely, I think the central bank in Russia says the Russian reserves will run out next year. And historians will tell you, political scientists will tell you that when that happens, leaders and states tend to make what look like irrational and very aggressive decisions. So that's the worst case scenario. So it's probably in all our interests that prices of oil and so on come up. But that rise of the East will start to attract scholars, I think. Yes?
Thank you for a fascinating lecture. You spoke about our limited perspective in the study of history. I was born and raised in Italy, and I'm familiar with Roman history. I have family in Greece. I know that they study the Hellenistic history in a very different perspective. For us, it used to be, lost of freedom of the city-state. For them, is the expansion of the Greek birth. I wonder whether you can speak a bit about how history is studied now in other parts of the world, in the Middle East or in China.
Well, it's not. I don't want to over-promise, so it's not something that I can speak of with any particular authority. But it is. I'm a humble historian. I spend my days, like many of you do, in a library. It's not glamorous. It's not exciting. It's hard work, and then you produce something that you ask any Tom, Dick, and Harry to judge on Amazon or in a review. So it's not something one would naturally choose to do. But what is incredible is that the thing I'm most surprised about my book and its reception. I'm thrilled how it's been received all over the world. But in places like India, Pakistan, and Central Asia, and in China, the level of engagement about somebody joining these dots together. I mean, I went to Lahore. I had people at Lahore airport wanting selfies with me. That doesn't happen. 20 years I've been teaching in Oxford. Not one of my students has ever asked me for a selfie, because there is an idea that there is a way of connecting all these countries and explaining their history. And so I'm not, in terms of how they see their own histories and what they teach, I think that there is an awareness all around the world that we're in a time of change. But giving voices to parts of the world that have a proud history that is glossed over has been very, very important. I think that's the best thing I could offer. My contribution, micro contribution to humanity's advancement, is to try to allow people to see that the West hasn't always been on the top, that this wasn't a straight line from Athenian democracy to Imperial Rome to the Enlightenment and the Renaissance Enlightenment and democracy, because we have a sense, I think, that we are the chosen ones in the West, that people should be more like us. And one of the realizations with scholars I talk to in the Arab world, in Russia, Central Asia, India, and so on, is that that's true that we've learnt these lessons, but it's no coincidence that the Holocaust was perpetrated in Europe. That genocidal suffering is not something that it looks familiar, however awful the TV images are on the news in the last 10 years. That there is a way in which this birth of something in Asia may be something that has some positive outcome. So, I think it's important to try to put a context into what history means and to try to round things out. So I don't know how things are taught and perceived, but I think that this is a point of shifting sands where people are deeply excited, deeply interested in trying to look at world history in a different way. Yes.
To continue that, I think one of the interesting things about your book is this transnational perspective. I very much enjoyed that, and thank you for that. And I think there's been a number of books that have attempted, there's an extraordinary history of the Mediterranean from prehistory to late classical time, that attempts that, so almost that similar sort of sweep with quite a different sort of set of data and a subject as yours. And so we've got this on the one hand, and then on the other hand we've got the academy and the publishers pushing for handbooks, encyclopedias, you know, the guide to this. There's almost this condensation of knowledge into very sort of atomistic short things. And then books like yours, The History of the Mediterranean, I can't remember who wrote it, the After Rome, Inheritance of Rome book, again, this transnational big sweep history. And I think where it's interesting is what people like you write now, and what those historians write now, is what will be taught in the universities in the next 5 years, in the schools in the next 10, 15 years. And it seems we've got two different directions going. I just wonder, with your crystal ball, as a historian, I mean, what's your hope for it? I mean, where can you see the academy moving?
Well, I'm sure you do things differently at Yale, but in Oxford it takes 6 or 7 years to bring a new paper on board. And like I said, we are no worse at Oxford. In fact, probably slightly better in our sort of in our engagement with non-European or Western history. You know, I think what's hard is that it's whether one likes it or not, history becomes a little bit like fashion, and I'm sure that there will be now lots of books writing sweeping global histories, and I'm sure lots of them will be terrific as well, and will teach all of us, including me, lots of things that I never thought of, and then there'll be something else that's new, and a new way of trying to look at things. What's difficult, I think, is how does one teach? One forgets about the themes in history and how historians are writing. What are you trying to teach in history classes to school children and to university students? Because it's very hard to cover everything. And when we specialize, and all of us as academic historians, when I'm writing about 11th century poetry in the Byzantine world, that I know that there are 5 people in the world who are much cleverer than I am, but they're the only people who will want to read it. There is a point at which we all have to balance that engagement with the public and with wider historians, including specialists actually, and the kind of the fine detail work. And I hope if my book is good and it is perceived well by fellow historians, it's that it stands up when you stand, like a picture, when you stand close up to it, the fine pointing has to be right. And I think that's the thing I'm most proud of, having written it. I don't know whether many people will be able to do that many languages that close up, because it's I was very, very lucky with the way I got set up. Speaking Swedish as a boy, learnt Russian at school, learnt some Arabic at school, ended up having to bring my Greek up to a standard that is, to be able to teach. All the European languages fell into place, and then pushing eastwards, it's hard to get that right. And the problem is, I suppose, that because we teach Latin and Greek at schools, it's very hard to see how you take that across into Eastern languages that are set up and structured differently. So I don't know what's going to happen. The publishers do commission and drive things based on customers. I think probably students are customers today as well, and choose courses and choose professors and choose institutions they want to work with. But you can't have one without the other. You can't do big history without the fine pointing. And so there is a tough balance. I was talking about it just now with Professor Kalivas. Actually, I'm quite happy. I much rather write the little stuff because I can have as many footnotes as I like, and you're not watering things down. So I mean, there was so much, tons of stuff. I did weeks, months on urbanization of cities in the Dutch Republic, and it became one sentence. I'm very good on urbanism in the 1740s, but you can't write it unless you go to that level of detail. So I think it's just getting that balance right. I have no idea what the book trade will do, but the good news is that people do buy history books, and they buy quite thick history books. Although I did say it's only about 40 pages longer than 50 Shades of Grey, but people's reaction is, "My God, it's enormous." But it's not that long. But I mean, that gives us. I think that gives hope to all of us. I mean, it's an amazing thing to write a history book and people to buy it all over the world. There is a real appetite. So I was a cynical academic, thinking people don't read anymore and they just play on their PlayStations and they're too busy having cups of coffee with each other. But actually, you can make it work. Yeah.
Yeah, just sort of similar to the previous questions. As an undergraduate, I'm very interested in your brief discussion of pedagogy and sort of the implicit Eurocentrism that often shows up in the curriculum of a number of these Western institutions. And so you seem sort of critical of what I think you called the buffet model, where one might just take a token course about some non-German philosopher, non-French novelist. And so I'm curious, what do you think one ought to do to really escape this Eurocentrism or broaden one's horizons, other than reading your book, in sort of a very meaningful way?
Well, I think all you can do as a historian is write about something you think is interesting and provide your own perspective. That's it, and everybody will, like taking a photograph. That's my shot of what I think is the best way of looking at what I can see in front of me, and I love seeing what other people's perspectives are. And I think that the point is not to harangue and harass and say, look, there's a different way of doing things, and all just read my book. I think it's that what I found most rewarding is joining lots of dots together. And one of the problems we have as teachers, and one of the problems we have as students, is that the specialization, you're expected to drill down really tight. And that means it's very hard to come out and know a bit about everything, because you haven't got all your life to specialize and so on. But I do think that there is a way in which trying to find out about lots of things. I mean, it's true, my book isn't, it is a history of the world, but it's not really, because I don't write about Chile or New Zealand or the Pacific or not much about sub-Saharan Africa. And, but it's trying to explain why we are where we are here today. And I'd have thought that's the question that a student would want to understand. Why does the 2016, what are the problems in the world, and why are they as they are? And if that means that's not to say that learning about imperial ceremony in Constantinople in the 11th century, which I teach, has its value too. But again, it's the same answer, which is trying to juggle the two. There's nothing wrong with the buffet, but it doesn't achieve anything. Yes.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could comment, please, about the knowledge transfer from the east to the west, and was Arabia was the middle point there, which enhanced the transfer, or what was the role of Middle East in the knowledge scientific and mathematical knowledge?
Okay. Over 5,000 years?
2,000 years.
Well, we are, I think I'm a little bit jet lagged, so I'm not at my most fluent. So I apologize. I think we have a capacity of lightness and darkness as an animal. We're an animal, human beings, obviously, and we have the capacity to destroy and to kill each other, and a capacity to be curious. And I think that curiosity is our species at its best, of wanting to taste things, wanting to learn things, wanting to find out, wanting to listen. That's the best quality we have. History mostly gets taught about the destruction bit. We focus on wars. We focus on leaders who kill each other or win wars, and we celebrate those who fight and break things down. But that curiosity of ideas is absolutely at its strongest in Asia. So, but again, there are spikes when there are financial resources that allow that to happen. So in particular, in the Middle East and the Arabic-speaking world, that profound spike comes around about the year 700 or so, where the most lucrative parts of the old Persian, Parthian Empire and of the old Roman Empire, Egypt, plug in together. Byzantium is put under proper pressure, nearly snuffs it. And that world that is rich, curious, starts to attract mathematicians, whether they are Hindu, whether they're Buddhist, but from India. They try to attract scholars from the Greek world as well, to drag people in together to share ideas. And the geographers in the Arab world in the year 8 or 900 start to write, like Masudi says, he describes all of the world, and he explains why it is that the Indians are great philosophers, why they are so important in their concepts of trigonometry and their use of astrology. And when astronomy, beg your pardon. And then when he reaches Europe, he says, there's just no point me explaining the continent of Europe. And we struggle to understand where these scholars that produced Pythagoras and Euclid and Ptolemy, where are they? Because we venerate the work of these great individuals, but we can't understand where they went. And the Arabs speculate that it's because of the tyranny of Christianity and religious fundamentalism. And we find a good answer to that in Augustine of Hippo, one of the great church fathers, who says, it's not the role of humans to question what God put on this world. You should be accepting rather than ask too many questions. And of course, it's almost exactly the opposite way around today with ISIS and its return towards a sort of 7th century of no questioning at the expense of your life. And we in the West understand the curiosities. But that passion for understanding Aristotle, for understanding mathematics, is all embracing. And the great scholars like Ibn Sina, writing in what's now Uzbekistan, it's fabulous to read. I had to study Aristotle as an undergraduate, and I'm not necessarily above average intelligence, but I'm above average educational standards, and I found Aristotle impossible to understand. I couldn't understand what was important and why. I couldn't understand which bits were exciting and which bits were mundane. But when I read Ibn Sina, I was one of the greatest philosophers in the Arab world. He writes 1,000 years ago, he says, I was told to read the Nicomachean Ethics, and Aristotle, I couldn't make head or tail of it, and it troubled me. I couldn't sleep. I read it 40 times. I couldn't understand which bits were, and I'm flattering to follow in his footsteps. And he says, but what made sense was that one day I went to the market and I saw a sort of, what do they call, an idiot's guide to Aristotle, or Aristotle for dummies, that explained it. And I sat down, and suddenly the light bulb came over my head, and it all made sense and fell into place. And that's more or less how I understood Aristotle too, was some sort of epiphany moment where you realize that you've been trying to make sense of it in a different way. And this passion for trying to try understand the world around, try to find out the best ideas about mathematics fits alongside people's curiosity about which are the best furs to keep you warm in the winter, where do the best arrows come from, where are the best saddles made. Muqaddasi writing again about where the finest ceramics were made. He sort of gives advice saying never buy figs from Damascus because they never taste of anything and they're massively overpriced. That's important in a world that's curious and wants to retain knowledge so it can learn and share from it. And that exchange is multilateral. It's in all directions, but it does follow patronage, and it follows self-confidence. Self-confident, open societies are willing to ask questions and willing to have their minds changed about things. Oh gosh, yes.
So you've spent many of those 25 years studying also the Byzantine Empire and its long history. It's very long, very varied, very diverse. What are the things that stand out from this period of study that are not obvious to the rest of us?
Well, I can't remember which sort of Ocean's 11 film it is, but the Byzantine world, the Byzantine Empire, is the key to all of this.
In what sense?
Insofar as it provided the sort of the DNA double helix to understand that the Byzantine world, to really make sense of it, you need to understand the world as 360 degrees, from Scandinavia to the Slavs to the Arab world to the Persian Gulf to trade, ritual, kingship, kinship. And the Byzantines and their success for 1,000 years of creating a stable political system that is multi-climatic, multi-regional, multilingual, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, that stability and that ability for information to be constantly passing through Constantinople, gathering, is essentially the Silk Road book in fine point. I could never have written this without being a Byzantinist, because this world is absolutely the gateway to understanding all of the Silk Road. So if those don't want to start to look at the Silk Roads and global history, start with the Byzantine world, because all of these questions, that's where they've come from. The question of how do people travel? How do you gather information? How do you create stable government? How do you create tax? And of course, it's one of the great tragedies in our world that we don't, in Europe anyway, validate or value the Byzantine world. The word Byzantine or Byzantine is hugely negative in British language. Politicians use it always to mean over-administrative, over-complicated, rather than a byword for all the good things that we should learn about. So the key to understanding how a jigsaw is all interlinked, all comes from the Byzantine Empire, of seeing how, that's how it brought me there, of seeing how interconnections and modulations and exchange, the challenges and the opportunities that gave. And in fact, the book that I wanted to write was really about Constantinople from 300 to 1600. That's what I wanted to do, and look at this big patch. And when we were talking about it with my editor, he said, do you think you could bring it up to the modern day? And I said, absolutely no chance. And he said, please, very nicely, and offered to buy me a bottle of wine. And I said, well, look, I can see why it's important to try to connect the past more to the modern world for something like this. And I said, but if I've got nothing to say, there's no point in me writing it. And I was very lucky that, as it happened, WikiLeaks and the presidential archive underneath Saddam Hussein's palace, the tapes were all published because he recorded everything. The 20th century, the production of materials that allowed something new to be said about the 20th and 19th centuries, meant that after 2 years of working on it, I said, I think maybe I can try. And then I spent another 2 or 3 years actually writing it. And, so I think that the trying to connect, and Byzantium is the link between the past and the present, and those of you who have on the Hellenic Studies program understand that too. And these complicated questions of how does ancient Athens connect through beyond, and they're not easy ones to answer, but that bridge provides the key. Like I said, it provides it's like discovering the double helix. So this is how, if you can answer it for Byzantium, you can answer it for the much wider period, a much wider region, and so on. So I could never have done this without that as my background. Yes?
Peter, you spoke a little bit about the pursuit, the relentless pursuit of technological innovation in the West. Can you talk a little bit about what motivates it coming out of the Dark Ages, and why we see perhaps what many people consider an opposite direction in the East?
Well, I think it's a very tricky question, and it depends how one hypothesizes these things. But I think the starting point is that why is it that castle building and aristocratic elites dominate the history of medieval Europe, and they don't exist in the East? They don't exist in the Byzantine Empire. Families in Byzantium can compete for normally 1 or 2 generations, unless they're part of the imperial elite, and even then it doesn't happen. There is a constant drive towards meritocracy. If you're not good enough, you get the chop. And there are some, but not many, exceptions to that rule. And it's the same for the East as well. Where are the Ottoman elites? Where in the Arab world, even in tribal systems, there is a constant recycling of who has power. And so I think it starts to beg the question, what is it in Europe that people feel the need to reinforce their buildings to protect their assets? Why are we against that process? Why do we work in a different direction? I suppose one hypothesis would be because our markers in Europe are so few. The resources here, we can grow crops more or less anywhere. There's no gold, very little silver, not much tin. But those precious commodities, because we don't have them, no silks, no ceramics, whatever, are the desire to create hierarchies and protect those hierarchies. Perhaps that's why it's more pronounced. It's very speculative. It's easy to say it. Actually, writing, going into more detail needs to be a bit less glib. But there is something about the rhythm of social structures in Europe that looks to me very different and requires some answer. My guess is that maybe it's because we are all too similar, and that's why we have developed different languages. That's why we developed so many political units, so that in 1500 there were 500 political units in Europe, which is the size of Kazakhstan, Europe. It's not, and those 500 units constantly fought each other to the point that those 500 by 1900 became 25. So that process of the strong eating and devouring the weak, of constantly competing, and that competition has its benefits too. It's not in the case of England, but it's produced sporting excellence. It's produced innovation. The upside to constantly competing there are many good things that come from that too. When I was a boy, age 13, we had 250 boys in my year. We were all put in a theatre, something like this, and had our names read out in reverse order of how we did in our school exams. And the bottom 3 were told in front of the whole year, general total failures. And that idea that you need to do better, you need to accumulate more, you need to compete, you need to fight, is a rhythm that is very different, even in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the East as well. That process of, maybe it's because of the rhythm of civic life as well. There are natural limits to how big cities could be built in climatic zones that are warm, until air conditioning and so on and so forth. So it meant that cities in Europe grew much bigger, and that also galvanized competition and trade.
Do you see a shift of the same mentality from the West to China today?
I haven't thought about it, and B, I'm probably not qualified to really answer that well. but the change of city, the rise of megacities in China is, I think, one of the most interesting questions there is right now. The current urban plan for Beijing envisages an urban population of 100 million people. And that starts to raise questions about water supply, resources, food, energy, and so on. And because we live in the present, we don't envisage what the challenges that might present to us here in the West is. But China's economic plan at the moment runs out till 2049. In Britain, we've got no idea what our economic plan is for the end of this month, because of Brexit. So I think that in China that there is going to be change because of urbanization, but that's not all been an entire success. The cities in Western China have had a lot of infrastructure built. There's a big slowdown right now. But in Greece as well, the Chinese are thinking very strategically in terms of the acquisition of the port of Piraeus and of other investments, that process of diversification, of constructing long-term plans is part of what that changing world around us looks like. Yes?
Do you have a favorite history of Byzantium, say, from the past 50 years?
The best history of Byzantium is written by Anna Komnene, the Alexiad, written in the 1140s, 1150s. That is required reading for anybody who ever wants to know anything about Constantinople. It's the worst years of my life translating a text, because it's so hard to both do justice and to capture the nuance of a language of a scholar, of someone whose frames of reference I'm aware working in a world that, but that is the best single book about the Byzantine Empire that you could ever hope. And the pages turn themselves. It's longer than my book, by the way, but that is what you should read. In terms of English language, there are some terrific books. It depends a little bit on what your interests are. I have still a soft spot for Stephen Runciman, who writes lyrically. His interpretations may not quite be voguish at the moment, but there's lots of good stuff. Everell Cameron writing about the Byzantines. There are a lot of terrific scholars writing about Biz on its own and Byzantium on its own and the wider world. But start with Anna Komnene, then go to Procopius, but don't believe everything you read in the books. One more, and then everyone can have a glass of wine. Do I want the glass of wine? Then everyone can have a glass of wine. One more. Okay. Yes.
Your title was not the end of history. And the end of history, you said, meant that we were all going to become liberal democracies. So if we're not all going to become liberal democracies, what are we going to become? What is the future?
I'm hoping you're going to be able to tell me that when we have a drink, right? This is what political science is all about. But I think the return of history, I'm not scoping. I think that what I'm trying to flag with that is that we need to understand the past, and we need to look at the past in a different way. Historians are not a luxury in humanities programs. We are not esoteric, looking at small pockets of the past that have no link into today. That return of history is fundamental. And in the parts of the world that I look at, like I said, the parts of the world I think matter, control of the past is central in political dialogue. So in Erdogan's Turkey, in Putin's Russia, in China today, in India and Pakistan, even with ISIS and Daesh, the fundamental political point scoring and the framing of what's happening in the world is all done with reference to the past. In the latest edition of the in-house ISIS magazine, it's all about the 7th century and about the Emperor Heraclius and the campaigns of the Arab armies against the Byzantine Empire. They have that's also on your reading list too if you want to read about Byzantium, but also don't believe everything you read there either. But that the past is alive, and the control of the past is absolutely central. So the return of history is not, I'm not trying to predict what political systems will look like. I think we've all been around the block to know that what liberal democracy brings in its best are those tolerances that prevent us from doing harm to each other. It's no coincidence that even in established, what used to be called liberal democracies, we're experiencing proper problems with that as a concept, whether it's through Donald Trump or the rise of the AfD in Germany, or the kinds of problems we see all over Europe right now and beyond, that the rise of a far right that is intolerant, that doesn't want to share these kind of common bonds that we have with our fellow man and woman. But so I think it's just the point that we need to reflect better on other people's histories. We need to reflect better on our own past to understand where we fit into the grand scheme of things, rather than that sort of story of mythologies where we're convinced that we are the source of lightness and other people should be more like us. The Romans felt that at a certain time too. The Byzantines felt that at a certain time too. In that moments of change, having the humility to listen, I think, is important, and that starts with learning.
Great.